So thank you very much, Dr. Abbasi, for inviting me to be the moderator of this panel titled We Stand Together in Faith, Interfaith Dialogue on Perceptions and Practices of Faith and Mental Health. This idea came about, I think, in response to a panel that was organized a few weeks ago now, in response to some of the violence, I think, that was being observed, that was being perpetrated on people of South Asian origin in the United States. Unfortunately, this violence has a longer history than just the events that precipitated this this panel that we held a few weeks ago. Dr. Abbasi has been heading the Muslim Mental Health Association now for a number of years. And some of the issues that I think are faced by Muslim Americans are actually common to issues that we face across communities with different religious heritage. And so the idea was to bring together a panel of people, which Dr. Abbasi has very kindly done, to think about issues that perhaps straddle, issues that are also different for people from different communities, different faiths, but all having a common South Asian thread. So with that in mind, Dr. Abbasi, with Mary Firdausi, who I think is in the room, thank you for organizing it, have put together this panel, We Stand Together in Faith, Interfaith Dialogue on Perceptions. And so what I'm going to do is, I think perhaps what I'll do is I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and I'll introduce them as they appear on the flyer. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Abbasi first, then perhaps ask you to say a few words. Then I'll move on to Dr. Sood, ask you to say a few words, then to Dr. Khosla, and then to Professor Mandair. And then once you've said a few words, perhaps for 5 or 10 minutes, we'll open it up into conversation mode. And the audience will be welcome, obviously, to chime in. In the meantime, if anybody in the audience has any questions, please feel free to post them. I believe we have a chat box open. But let me move now to the first introduction, and that's Dr. Farha Abbasi. Dr. Farha Abbasi is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Michigan State University and a core faculty member of the Muslim Studies program. Her areas of interest are cultural psychiatry and teaching medical students how to provide culturally appropriate care to Muslim patients. She is the founding director of the annual Muslim Mental Health Conference and the Muslim Mental Health Consortium. Her recent awards include the Mayor's Town Hero Award from Lansing, the Gen Sen, that is the Center for Gender in Global Contexts, Inspiration Award, and the Diversity Award from the American Psychiatric Association. So welcome, Dr. Abbasi. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So everyone, salam, shalom, sat sri akal, namaskar. So it's great to be here with all of you. And I especially am thankful for Siddharth, South Asian Studies, Muhammad Khalil, Muslim Studies Center, Mary Firdausi, for finally helping us put this together. The reason I felt it was important is that as a practicing Muslim, we have felt the pressure of being able to be visibly, be able to be in your faith, practice your faith in peace, where our essence of all our religions and faith is being in peace with yourself and being at peace with everyone around you. So that's what I hope to explore today. And faith and religion has a direct impact on your mental wellness, well-being, and it can be a source of resilience, or it can start to become a source of distress. So that's why I think this relationship and this dialogue is so important. Just a quick disclaimer. When we were putting this panel together, we wanted to focus on the majority religions that are being victimized or are being targeted. But it doesn't mean that subcontinent doesn't have other religious representations. We do have other major religions present in the South Asia including Christianity, Judaism, Baha'i religion. So to acknowledge their presence as well, that we are keeping all of them in our minds and hearts as we discuss this. Thank you.
Give me just a moment. I'm having a connection problem. I'll be with you in just. Thank you very much, Dr. Abbasi, for those comments. We'll now move to some introductory comments from our second panelist, and that is Mrs. Sapna Gill Sood. Mrs. Sood has a master's degree in clinical psychology. She is currently a resident of Holt, Michigan. She's originally from Chandigarh, India, and has been settled in Lansing since December 2003. She has been a part of PGI-MER Chandigarh, the clinical lab of Michigan State University, the PATS, the Preventative and Training Services Institute, and has a number of publications in bipolar disorder and the autism spectrum disorders. She is also currently supporting her husband's practice. She has served on many boards and committees in the Bharati Temple of Lansing and the Indian Cultural Society, and her main interest is to promote equality, tolerance, peace, and prosperity. Mrs. Sood?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Namaste, Sasrikal, and good afternoon. I would like to thank especially Farha to include me into this. And, this topic is very interesting because, we all follow some or the other faiths, and the direct impact how these faiths have, in the current way that things are going upon mental health is really important, especially, coming from a Sikh background. I have realized that since 9/11, there is a very different impact how things are viewed. Just due to basically the public display of the Sikhs, which is very similar to what the baptized Al-Qaeda leaders had at 9/11. So, there's a lot of fear, anxiety, which is attached to it about presenting your true self. And we see on and off since then, there are these hate crimes and, people struggling for their own identity. So I really feel that this interfaith dialogue is very, very important, where we all learn, the basic gist of this dialogue is to, learn tolerance towards other faiths, to, be a little more accepting and to understand, because the base of all faiths is one, that is equality, humanitarianism, and peace. So thank you, and I look forward for, the questions and participation.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks, Ms. Sood. Let's move on to Shuchi Khosla. Dr. Shuchi Khosla serves as the Chief Psychiatry Resident at Michigan State University. She concurrently works as a consulting psychiatrist for the emergency department at Sparrow Hospital. Born and raised in India, she completed her medical school at Goa Medical before moving to Michigan for her residency. She has been awarded the American Psychiatric Association's SAMHSA Minority Fellowship for the year 2021-22 to continue her work related to combating stigma, advocacy of mental health, and culturally competent education on mental illness in the underserved immigrant communities from South and Central Asia. Dr. Khosla?
Thank you, Siddharth. And is it Siddharth or Siddharth? I want to say Siddharth.
It's Siddharth.
Thank you. And your middle name, same as my dad's middle name. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is it kind of leads me into one of the two things I want to talk about. Identity and cultural conundrums. Hi, I'm Shuchi Khosla. And if you can say that right, that means you're already ahead of 90% of the people I meet every single day. So there's two things. Thanks, Dr. Abbasi, for organizing the panel, and Mary. And thank you all for getting me on here. Two things that I really like to talk about. One, identity. Who am I? How I describe it in this bicultural context. And two, the cultural conundrum that we live in, growing up in a different country and moving to another country. So I'm a first-generation immigrant. I identify as an Indian American, and I also identify as a woman. I identify as somebody who is a follower of Arya Samaj who practices Vedic religion. And in that long list of identities, I find myself standing in a few cultural conundrums, which I wonder if other people on the panel and the audience feel the same. Three examples that I like to share. One, what do you say when you go to sleep? So if somebody's going to sleep, what's the normal response that we hear in cultural context? You'd say good night and sweet dreams. So I grew up in a Vedic household where at the age of 2.5, 3, you start learning Sanskrit and you start learning Havan mantra. So the mantra for sleep, as you say with its meaning, which I was taught at age 1, is saying out loud, God, help me focus my mind so solely that I do not have any dreams. Contrast that with the idea of going tonight and saying sweet dreams to you and everyone around you. The other big cultural conundrum example I kind of like to talk about is I grew up with understanding of yoga called yog, not yoga, and focusing back on Patanjali yoga. So if someone's not aware of it, I'll walk through a minute of how it works. Back in the 4000 BC, when all the Vedas were being written, a very smart man called Patanjali, Maharishi Patanjali, brought up 197 verses put together and formed Patanjali Yoga. Now, Patanjali Yoga, if you're a hammer, everything is a nail, right? Everything to you is a nail. So I'm a psychiatrist. To me, it sounds entirely like a mindfulness document. Tells you about how to quieten your mind, what phase is yam, niyam, it's ashtang, so it has 8 limbs, right? You go from taking away the bad things, focusing to the positive things. How can you focus your attention so that you can reach self-actualization? 3 months here, and I realized somebody walked up to me and said, oh, yoga, I practice yoga. And I'm all excited. I'm like, tell me about it. And they're like, yeah, I go to this hot yoga. And we do this hot yoga 3 times a week. Now, hot yoga, or not hot yoga, but hot yoga, or Bikram yoga in its format is about as far as you can think of compared to the Patanjali yoga I grew up with. So one of the things which I wanted to share, and I hope we'll move forward when we talk about discussions, is the cultural conundrums of existing in between of what you knew as normative and what somebody else comes up as an understanding of normative. And I think that's a huge reason for why we sometimes judge and sometimes think that we cannot be together. So that's my sort of hope, that we talk about how we can expand our definitions of normative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khosla. I'm sure there'll be a lot of conversation about this and some of the related phenomena you've brought up. Our fourth panelist is Professor Arvind Palmander. He is an associate professor of Sikh studies at the University of Michigan. He received his Ph.D.s from the University of Warwick and Aston University in the UK. Though grounded in the study of Sikhism and South Asian religion and philosophy, his research interests are located at the intersections of various disciplines, including continental and global philosophies, post-colonial theory, theories of religion, violence, and the secular, political theory, cross-cultural encounters, and translation theory and practice. He's also the author of a number of books on various aspects of the Sikh tradition and philosophy. So, Professor Mandair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you to the organizers, especially to Dr. Abbasi for inviting me here. It's a wonderful, wonderful idea. I'm delighted to be on this. I've never delved into faith as a term before. So this is like an exploration that I haven't done forever. It's something that my training as a scholar of religion, we're meant to distance this from the work that we actually do. So this has been an interesting exercise, and it's brought up aspects similar to what Shuchi has just talked about. So hopefully there will be some resonance here. So let me begin with the first question that I was asked: what does it mean to be a part of a faith? And in my case, part of the Sikh faith, if we use that word, and how does it strengthen us? I'm going to go into some personal sort of observations here, and I'll try not to take more than about 5 minutes or so. So the word Sikh really means somebody who learns, or somebody who is a learner, somebody who is engaged on a path of constant learning. But to learn authentically is to be continually open to transforming oneself as one travels on the path of life. Okay, so it's very much to do with self-transformation. And it's not just a transformation that is done to oneself, but also in relation to others. It's done in communities, not necessarily one's own community, but in relation to communities that you may not have nothing in common in as well. For me, it's taken a lifetime to learn this simple meaning. So when we talk about faith, it's impossible for me to separate faith also from the lived experience, the environment in which I grew up. So permit me a couple of minutes just to talk about that. I grew up in the UK. My parents were immigrants in the 1960s. They didn't have much time for piety or religious reflection, more involved in just putting food on the table, as a lot of immigrants are. Until obviously much later in life, when they did embrace piety, religious reflection, spiritual reflection. They lived their lives mainly in the bubble of what I would call Punjabiyat, Indian culture, if you like, and identified as Sikh, as Punjabi, as Indian, however they were forced to identify in a sense. Unlike my parents, though, being a second generation Sikh, the early part of my childhood, my coming to age, my experience of faith was situated in a very different environment, which one could describe as a blending, as a syncretism of different religions. So I was between Christianity at school, Sikhism at home, and constantly moving in between one understanding and another, between different cultures, British secularism outside, Punjabiyat at home, or Sikh at home as well. And so, you know, being exposed to different cultural environments, to different traditions, to different shared experiences of language, of music, of spirituality, that's what Punjabiyat meant to us. And the early television programs at that time, catering
to our surroundings, with our optimum talent and time, and then to be targeted for those beliefs is very hard to navigate. And as a Muslim right now, it is not only scary and anxiety provoking or in fear, not only for yourself, but anybody who sounds and look Muslim, which all of you can, right? So it's like the collective vicarious trauma, carrying that collective vicarious trauma, that every time incidents happen in any other religious setting or faith setting, or you kind of feel that trauma impacting you as well. So that is something I would like to ask my co-panelists. Is one thing is we all have traveled this journey through cultures, through personal challenges, have gotten to a place of who we are, being our authentic selves. But then how are you navigating this surrounding conflict, and how is it impacting you? So I would really appreciate if you guys share that. How is this trauma impacting you all? And how you are coping, staying within, true to your belief system, values, how you are coping with it. So I can open it up. We can start with Sapna. you wanna, or whoever wants to contribute right now.
Sure. Thank you, Farha. See, like I said, since 9/11, it is basically the physical, the representation. It's a lot of people I have seen with time, a lot of Sikhs who, they don't want to wear a turban because they are having that, conflict. They're having that thing, the identity, especially the newer generations, they are split between the two. They want to follow the faith because of their family traditions and everything. At the same time, they want to move away from it because they want to fit in. And they are scared whenever there's a hate crime, they're scared to be recognized. Then they start, moving out of things. So, for me personally, I think it is more of, the women, the Sikh women, we still, if we wear our own traditional outfits, we can be recognized, but it is more difficult for the men who have the turbans on. And, how I just feel, I think Dr. Mandair, he might be able to, talk more about it, because he is following it so religiously. But I just feel that there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear each time now, like the FedEx incidents took place. It is just having a lot of impact mentally to be yourself, identity crisis of what you are. And then I also feel that for when any kind of psychological treatment is done, we need to really recognize what are the gists of Sikhism. How do we really approach these kind of people for the right kind of treatment?
I can speak briefly if you want to that. Thank you for both opening that, Dr. Abbasi, and Sapna for continuing that. Let me turn the thing around a little bit. My experience of coming to this country was within a few days of 9/11. I said this in the last talk that I gave. I think I entered on the 13th. We were coming in on a plane from it was coming from the Middle East somewhere. I think it was an Emirates flight or something like that. And I can tell you the fear in the cabin. Nobody wanted to embark and deplane. We just wished that the plane would stay there. It was actually terrifying. More so if you looked in the way that I did. But interestingly, I had to go to class literally the next day. I was already 5 or 6 days late coming out of England. And here I am landing at JFK and then going to class the next day. One of our secretaries had to chaperone me around to make sure that there was a white person next to me so that I wasn't, attacked or anything like that. It was pretty bad. But then coming into the classroom and facing these kids who had just been bombarded with these images of the Twin Towers and stuff, and now they've got this bearded turban guy who they immediately associate with Osama bin Laden, facing them and teaching them. I was less scared, but what I saw on their faces was abject fear. And that's when I realized that, hang on, the situation's the other way around. They're more afraid than we are. And it was really interesting. So I really got to work from the first class to kind of just calm them down. I was teaching Asian philosophy. So I dug into all of the spiritual teachings from Taoism and Sufism, Hinduism, Sikhism, etc., and brought them into the question of the ego and what is identity, what is the ego, etc. And it's only when they started understanding that and applying it to themselves, just began to see how they had been kind of socially engineered into feeling this trauma and fear in the way that they did. And this has carried on. So in short, I mean, I've responded to this by taking this into all of my classes, and it's taken me a couple of decades to develop a class specifically to do with issues of mental health and the relationship to spirituality. I taught it twice already, and I'm teaching it another time. It's called Spirituality and Consciousness. Looks at the idea of consciousness, and it's all driven by this particular experience that you're describing here. And that's my response, is to get this out to students, to get them to understand their own mindset. Because if you can deal with that fear in somebody who is supposedly hostile to you, if you can remove the fear and the enmity, that's the crucial thing. And that obviously comes partly from your own spiritual traditions as well. But I've probably spoken too long, so I'm going to leave it there.
It was well said, though. It wasn't too long. Thank you for sharing. I've seen comments coming in saying, this is really helpful. Thank you for sharing your story. And I'm happy to jump in here because I joke with Dr. Abbasi a lot. I'm a practicing Arya Samaji Indian, born and raised. Right? Dr. Abbasi is a practicing Muslim from Pakistan, and we sometimes over lunch laugh that our relationship might be the epitome of India-Pakistan relationship that ever existed. Which kind of brings me to what you were saying as well, Arvind, and what Dr. Abbasi and Dr. Also hinting at. What do we fear? I think we fear what we do not know and what we do not understand. And that's sort of what I like to keep front and center in my mind. Yes, all the religions, all the faiths, the eventual goal sounds very much the same when you listen to them talk about it. But there's also a reality attached to it that the reason why there are different religions is because somebody many, many, many years ago decided that there's only a way, a single way to get there. And when I say a single way, I don't mean like a monotheism versus polytheistic religion. What I mean is the whole idea of religion was defining a way of how you could get to what you want. And even though what everyone might desire might be the same, the normative way of how it's perceived to be getting there is vastly different in the way it is practiced. That's one of the things I really like being mindful of. And whenever there's trauma surrounding it, the number one question I like to ask is, where are they trying to get by doing what they're trying to do? And is my definition of what's okay to be done so narrow that it has no place for other definitions to coexist with respect? In terms of viewing what we do not know differently, I always talk about what the transition from India to this country was for me versus my brother. I'm a 5 foot, coffee with 2 creams woman, and he's a 6'1" brown guy with beard, tall and well built. Our experiences moving down the street in this country are both vastly different. When he moved here, for the many, many years, and he went to Michigan State, and now he works and moves to different cities, he talks about the experience of being stared at pretty consistently, walking through the airports, walking down the street, being in towns that are don't have a lot of minority. And I kind of smiled back at him and say, karma comes full circle. I'm a girl who lived by myself in India. Being stared at was pretty normal, right? If you're a young woman and you're walking down the street in a country where being able to see somebody of the opposing gender increases curiosity in the general population, and you being stared at is something you grew up with, maybe you develop that resilience for when it's being done to you here that you don't even notice. And since he did not have that opportunity growing up, or did not have to face that down the street because he was the majority part of the country, he is now more aware of what's going on. Those, I think, are sort of the 2 questions which I like to ask. 1, how broad is my view of what's okay? And 2, am I feeling this because this is different from what I'm used to, from what's normal?
So if I may jump in, these are really interesting observations. I just wanted to add a couple, as of observations as somebody who's an immigrant, right, originally from India into the United States. And a lot of my research is on history. So I like to look at things from a very long perspective. And if you think about pretty much every one of the religious traditions that is represented here, right? They probably weren't around about 10,000 years ago, right? And this comes back to a theme that came up in the earlier panel of fluidity, right? I think the history of humanity is a history of fluidity, of physical fluidity. So we are constantly moving, right? Migration is a fact of human existence. If you ask anybody, almost anybody, anywhere in the world, right? Where did your ancestors come from? If you go far back enough in time, probably nobody's ancestors are from where they are currently located, right? So there's this history of physical fluidity. There is also a history, I think, of religious fluidity. If you look at, for example, Hinduism, right? What is Hinduism? Where do the traditions come from? They have been influenced repeatedly over thousands of years. There are many aspects of them that are what you might call almost foreign, or certainly come from what you would call other countries than the India as we know it today. They've been integrated into this tradition. There is no single Hinduism in India, just like there's no single Christianity in the United States. There are denominations and there are practices, and we see this in all religious traditions. You see it in Sikhism, you see it in Islam as well, right? So there is this constant evolution and fluidity. And there's a very, very good chance that your descendants, everybody here, if you have any or plan to have any, at some point of time, maybe 1,000 years into the future, will be practicing a totally different religious tradition, right? And so I think it's really important for us to view, I personally think, if we're going to have harmony, to view religion and religious practice as something that is not set in stone. It is constantly evolving. It is fluid. It will change. It's precious to us the way we were perhaps raised to view it. But what we view as precious to us may be the last thing that's, precious to somebody else 10,000 years down the line, who happens perhaps to be our own descendants, right? So I think the problem arises when religion becomes politicized, when it is used as a means of control. And I'm an economist, so my PhD is actually in economics, right? And one of the very interesting phenomena that we study in economics is the phenomenon of a monopoly, right? So if you own a firm and you want to make a lot of profit, right? The holy grail is attaining monopoly. Because if you have a monopoly, you can choose the price at which you sell. You can absolutely maximize your profits, right? And what you don't want is competition. Because if you are in a competitive market, it's going to whittle away at your profit margins, and there's only so much benefit you're going to be able to extract from whatever. I do view the politicization of religion and aspects of religious tradition that try to monopolize people who belong to those religions, and then to use them to advance these means, as being very similar to what happens in monopolies when we view them in economics. And to me, that perhaps, Farha, that's my attempt to answer your question about why we see all this violence. I think ultimately it becomes the act of people being monopolized, either willingly or unwillingly, and that is for somebody else to study because I'm not an expert in the field. But it is ultimately the act of the monopolization of people for the benefit either of themselves or of other people.
So building on that, and I would like to hear from the audience too, but quickly building on that, what if we were not in competition with each other? If we want to coexist, then it's not to impact the other person's practice, but how do we create that space where we all can coexist without being in competition? Because one thing definitely, violence actually has ended up unifying us more and has kind of made us look for those commonalities and the places and the points and opinions that could bring us together rather than further separate us. So my question to everyone is, what if we are not in competition with each other? At least in this country. I know back home, the politics takes over and the realities change, but what here, if somehow we create this utopia where we coexist and are not competing, but augmenting each other.
Farha, if I may, very quickly, because I did take a lot of time earlier. I think your question about competition is a word we use a lot in economics, right?
Right.
I'll answer it at the level at which I was trying to sort of, articulate my thoughts in the previous set of comments. Why is it? And this goes back, I think in a way to what Shuchi said earlier, right? About everybody trying to attain the same thing, perhaps through different methods. Why is it that I am not allowed to belong to more than one religion, right? Now, you may argue that some religions say you can belong to more than one religion. Why am I not allowed to belong to one religion, more than one religion? So that is where the competition starts. That is where the fault lines are created. And so long as you have those fault lines, you have people who remain vulnerable to manipulation by people for whom, yeah, they may claim they belong to a religious tradition, but the philosophy of the religion that they claim to belong to is probably the farthest thing on their minds, from their minds.
So adding on to you, Farha, I feel here the role of the interfaith dialogues, opening them up, propagating them, plays a major role that we need to, for the coexistence, that we need to tolerate each other. We need to understand each other. The ultimate gist of all religions, all faiths is the same. I think that is more important, the dialogue, to be more propagated. And so that's what I feel.
Yeah. If I can add to that very quickly, I think it's also requires each tradition, and every tradition has done this to a larger or a greater extent, but to move the self-projection or the projection of that tradition from externality to internality. In other words, I think if traditions can avoid projecting an external notion of the divine and focus on the divine as within, that internalization, which focuses on the self, it creates an immediate bridge between everybody. It becomes a human thing then, and not just a competition between different notions of God, which creates barriers, etc., which is one reason why people find it so difficult to belong to more than one tradition. I think, this is something that's happened in, especially in Asian traditions, generally from the Upanishads all the way down to modern Bhakti traditions, to Sufi traditions, etc., and others. I think that the focus should be on psychological well-being, which is at the heart of each of these traditions. And if that's the focus, then we're doing the same thing. We're achieving the same goal. Otherwise, it's like literally measuring each other according to an external yardstick, which is going to create competition. So I think the focus needs to change. And I'm kind of practicing that in a course that I teach called What is Religion? Where most of my students are from the Lutheran or Catholic background, or they're Jews. I get very few Asian or other students. I occasionally get a few. And it's really playing with a kind of language that is accessible to, I think, psychological well-being, that That's the trick here. And where I'm seeing the discourse of spirituality kind of moving, it's actually away from religion, more towards inner spirituality, which is the only way we can create an internal, a crossing between cultures. You have to kind of live this between different cultures.
Can I add something? This is Srina Gandhi, even though I'm not on the panel.
Sure, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say there's some research that has been done on the British Census of India. There's a few articles on it, and I can look them up. But if you look at the British Census, when they first started doing it in the early 1800s, every 10 years, you would see that they would just ask, "What religion are you?" And you had people answering like, "I'm a Hindu Mohammedan," or answering the question that the British did not like. And so then later on, if you look at the late 1800s, when they were doing the census, they asked people, "Are you a Hindu, or are you a Muslim, or are you a Sikh, or are you a Christian?" Like, they asked very specific questions, because this idea of, religious purity, or the idea that you belong to one religion or practice in one way, very much came out of two things. One, the Spanish or the Catholic Inquisition, where they would, not only in Europe, but also in the Americas, punish people for blending religious traditions, especially the indigenous and the enslaved populations. And then the other thing, it came out of the Protestant Reformation, where Luther, as well as people post-Luther, were very beholden to this idea that you had to have not only just a Protestant identity, but an identity within one particular church. And that had to do a lot with the consolidation of power as well, not just this idea that there's just one way to communicate with divinity. So those ideas are very much were brought over to South Asia and other parts of the world that were colonized. So this idea of one, what I'm just trying to say is this idea of that we have to be one religion, or that there's competition between religions, is something that also has at least some roots in colonialism. Thank you.
I would completely agree. That's a subject of my main monograph of 2009, which is Religion and the Spectre of the West. Basically, that what we call religion in South Asia acquired its blueprint from the Western colonial mindset, and it was essentially a Christian mindset. Even when it's secular, as the British pretended to be, it's still Christian through its secularism, and it creates an inside-outside opposition. Through political theology and all sorts of different mechanisms, which we don't need to go into here. But you're absolutely right, Srina.
I had a quick question. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
So my name is Hadiya. I'm a third-year medical student currently rotating through a psychiatry rotation in Ohio. And I've been thinking a lot about psychiatry and psychology as fields, and looking kind of into how they developed and such. And my own academic background is in religious studies. So my undergrad degree was in religion. And so I, to Dr. Mandair's kind of like last point, but also to anyone else, I know there are a couple of clinicians also on the panel. I was wondering if you had any comments on like psychiatry as what is like a secular field, but this kind of like what I think Dr. Mandair was mentioning, like this shifting of like spirituality being expressed in like more common psychiatric language, and like the integration of spirituality and like a biopsychosocial approach in psychiatry. Just any general comments like on this have just been on my mind, and I would love anyone's input on it.
I can give you my experience with it, because I'm trying to propagate faith-based mental health, which doesn't mean I'm teaching religion as such, but what I realized that especially practicing in this country, the fact that state and religion is separated kind of took away religion, spirituality, faith-based practices out of the medical curriculum. But what we understand now is that how, especially when it comes to mental illnesses, how one perceives what's happening to them is not happening in a vacuum. So the cultural the understanding, the religious practices, everything defines what you are feeling and how you are going to cope with it, right? So what I realized is that if we do not talk about religion as such, or faith or spirituality, whatever spectrum your patient is on, I think we are missing a very integral part of someone's identity. So like you have the panel here, we are on a spectrum of religion and spiritual practices, all of us, right? But if I don't feel that that's part of the dialogue when it comes to my well-being and wellness, then I would feel the disconnect that you are not understanding me. But traditionally, there has been fine lines, crossover between religion and mental illnesses, because what we see is when you are getting grandiosity or manic episode or psychosis, you tend to, and especially if you belong to religious and faith-based communities, the chances are your delusions become very religious. Like you feel you are God or God is talking to you, right? So we see that happening, that there is a lot of, and other piece that we deal with is that somebody belonging to a faith community going through depression or a mental health crisis might feel it as a spiritual crisis, being forsaken by God, or that God is punishing them, or God is expecting them to persevere in silence and not access care. So I felt that the relationship is so entrenched between mental wellness and religion and spirituality. So what happened with the wellness movement that has come in the recent times, we have gone back to practices of spirituality, like we borrowed from Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness. We borrowed from Hinduism, or the yoga concept of yoga, and then all the religious practices from Islam. I feel that they are all being practiced, but in name of spirituality. We still fear talking about religion as a wellness tool. So that's my take on it, that I do feel that we are at a point in psychiatry that we need to step away from paternalistic approaches and meet the patient where they are and be open to whatever they are bringing. So I hope that answers your question, that I think it is a very integral part of who you are.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Why don't you go ahead? I'll follow on that.
I just wanted to add one more line to almost exactly what he was saying. How important is religion as a psychiatrist to me? Religion is as important as it is to my patient. If for my patient, religion is something that defines them, then we talk about it. If for my patient, religion is something that's not even a part of their identity, then we don't even go there. The other important part is looking inwards, right? My religious beliefs are in a way coming in between, in any way, shape, or form, in my therapeutic relationship with my patient, right? Those are the only two times when religion walks into its practice, because it's all between me and my patient. So what's important to them versus is there anything in my life which is building up countertransference, which may be a problem in our therapeutic relationship, in which case we look inwards. And the rest of the time, we just take it as it is.
Shuchi, thank you for making that point. I think that's a really, really important point. And I'm glad you went first, because I think I can lead off straight from what you said. But, I think some of the trauma that people feel is based on how strongly they identify internally with their own. right? This goes back to a point I think Arvind was also saying, right? Making about the fear, right? I was afraid, and then I went and I said, wait a minute, they're even more afraid than I, though how could I possibly be any harmful in any way, right? You know that you're not, but wow, these people are looking at you, right? So a lot of this has to do with your internal makeup. And this is related to a different line of research we've done in psychology. We've published a couple of papers. And that is the notion, and this also, by the way, is inspired by some concepts in economics, but it's the idea of identity as a portfolio, okay? So if you view your identity as being a portfolio of different attributes, if you will, right? If your identity is very sort of one-dimensional, if you will, if the only thing that matters to you is religion to the exclusion of everything else, right? Then your day-to-day experience is going to be very, very heavily mediated by that aspect of your identity. And these kinds of problems, I think, will be more pronounced as a consequence of that, okay? If on the other hand, you have an identity or what we call in our research a self-portfolio that is much more diversified. Yes, religion is very important, but so is this and this and this and this and this and a whole bunch of other potentially buffering attributes, right? You are much more likely, much less likely to be buffeted by these kinds of things, almost no matter what's happening outside. It becomes, this goes back to Arvind's point about, internal, right? So another thing I think to think about is, to the extent that therapies allow this and it's ethical to do it and so on, to think about diversification of the self, right, as part of these therapeutic processes to protect and make and move patients into an area of more resilience, right? Now, there are ways to do that, right?
Right.
There are ways to enhance detachment from, we do this when you have phobias, right? I mean, you try to kind of make somebody resilient. There are ways to enhance detachment from different aspects of the self concept. That may be something to think about in therapy if it isn't already being done.
Right. Only thing to add to that is, again, going with Shuchi's point, and that you let the patient guide you, what is important to them in this portfolio. I think where the structural racism or institutional racism and policies come, when the system dictates that what is acceptable part of your identity. And that's where I think the conflict comes. I know we have just 1 minute, and I just really was hoping, Arvind, if you can talk about universal brotherhood and how can we all bring it together.
I would love to do that, but I had a...
You have 60 seconds to do that.
Oh, wow. All right. So I was going to ask you about psychiatry, the profession, but I'll focus on the brotherhood aspect, basically. I was coming out of this from the Mool Mantra, which is the opening mantra of the Guru Granth Sahib. And at the heart of it is the first point is oneness. How do you create a state of oneness? Not one God, but oneness everywhere. Two key essentials for that. Nirpal, no fear. Strike no fear in anybody and have no fear. And then nirvair, no enmity, no opposition. Those two factors are crucial. So, in other words, to realize the divine, it is absolutely essential for the self to be aligned in that particular way, without fear, without enmity. These are crucial, I think, and only in that way is our self going to become porous enough, flexible enough to become multiplicitous and create channels of coexistence with everybody. Sorry, that's all I could do.
That's good. For me, that's good. Because I
thought we were going until 1:30. I'm so sorry.
Oh, we are? Oh, that would change the whole, I don't know.
I don't know what the flyer said, but that's what I had on my calendar.
Mary, can you confirm? Oh, I would love to go till 1:30 if possible.
We didn't put any final time, so you can keep talking till 1:30.
Okay, then I guess if the panelists are okay with that, we can continue, definitely.
Can I just jump
I'd like
back
to hear
in?
more, yeah.
I wanted to ask, since that we have a lot of clinicians here, how does the profession of psychiatry deal with or feel, how does it push back against alternative kinds of therapies? Because what I'm hearing from students of color who want to be able to research their traditions and other traditions as potential places for accessing therapy and whatever, but they say that psychiatry as a profession will not allow this, right? Because it works in a particular way. Can you speak to that a little bit? And what are the challenges that the profession itself poses?
Why don't Shuchi, you go first now?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very good question. Something that we talk about every single day and go back and forth on a whole lot. So I want to start out by saying that the general mindset that psychiatry is against a therapy that's alternate is almost false in this particular day and age. We have expanded a whole lot about what our understanding is, and we've kind of moved many steps ahead from where Freud was in 19th century Vienna. That is not psychiatry anymore. Having said that, just like any other profession in medicine, in psychiatry, we like looking at things that are evidence-based. So you can want to do A, B, C, D, E. My response would be, yes, sure. Go ahead, try A, B, C, D, and E. But will A, B, C, D, or E change a symptom? I want to look at the evidence behind it, right? So we have therapies which have a lot of evidence behind it. And to your point, it's really hard to study therapies in terms of their effectiveness. There are certain therapies which work for certain symptoms and certain diagnoses, and we always propagate that. What you want to do for mindfulness has a huge range, right? Different people can find mindfulness in different ways. There's probably over 1,200 to 1,300 documented ways in which people practice mindfulness. So there's a lot of variability in that. But if people come up to me and say, oh, when I do this, it treats my depression, then I want to say, hey, do you want to run this therapy on a trial, right? Go ahead, get 20 people you give this therapy to and give the other 20 people treatment as usual, do it for 8 weeks, switch it out, publish your results. And then when you do that, I'm totally on board with you. So that's kind of where I come from the evidence-based perspective.
What if the underlying presumptions of the kind of therapies that are involved in these spiritual techniques don't align and cannot align with basic scientific methodologies? I'm speaking as a scientist as well.
Let me add to it. So we are walking a very fine line, right? Our goal becomes that we do want to bring in everything that can be beneficial to you till it's not having a harmful side effect, right? So one thing is therapy, but I know we are at a point in psychiatry where we are looking at nutritional psychiatry. What you eat is having an impact. How you live your life has an impact, right? I do see a lot of alternative treatments coming in, like use of turmeric or probiotics. Those are something that we can include. But now, of course, we are also dealing with onslaught of things like, can I use cannabis for attention deficit disorder? So that's where we kind of, it might be giving you relief, but it's not scientifically we know to the contrary. So that's the problem. Yes, it's legal. A lot of people find relief from it, but can we professionally, clinically say that it's going to benefit your ADD? In all fairness, it would be hard as a clinician. So I don't know what you're talking about, alternative therapy, what you mean. If it is going, like, let's say in our cultures from South Asia, going to the sage having amulets with the Quranic or religious verses written and putting it in water and drinking it every day, or saying certain verses is going to improve my depression so I don't need meds. Those are the places where, yes, continue to pray and do what needs to be done for your well-being. I'm not going to come out and say that has no scientific basis, because I do feel that will, if it's bringing you relief, bringing your distress down, go ahead and pray. But it doesn't mean I'm going to replace my Prozac with a prayer. If I feel you still need to be on meds, we need to navigate that. So, but again, if you are more specific, what alternative therapies they want to practice, I think we are pretty right now exploring as well. One thing with psychiatry is it has become very dynamic and very preventive. So we are very open now, because few years back, we didn't understand the importance of turmeric or probiotics, or what the gut bacteria has connection with brain. Now we are exploring that. Some foods make your mood better, you know, so we are looking and we are more open to it. But then there is a fine line that, like there are a lot of herbal treatments that might be passed on to you and you feel like it's part of your healing, but now know it has very bad detrimental impact on your stomach, or your liver can get affected by a chronic use of something. So those are the things that kind of becomes hard. But I think we also, I feel that this cookie cutter image of psychiatry is part of the stigma prevalent around mental illnesses. That, oh, psychiatrists only are pill pushers, or psychiatrists have their own agenda, or they are never listening to us. That's where the importance of using all the approaches, be it culture, be it religion, be it anything else that the other person wants to hear. We talk philosophy now. We bring in art now. We even are ready to talk music. So all that has come into your wellness. All these therapies are very integrated now.
That's absolutely fascinating to hear. It's incredibly reassuring as well. I've been conversing with neuroscientists about this as well. I've been conducting workshops with neuroscientists and stuff. And I have to be honest, they shut you down quicker than it seems than psychiatry would. It seems that psychiatry has finally become open to culture, the influence of culture.
Oh, it's a big movement right now in our country. It's the science of knowing your brain and art of cultivating your mind.
Interesting.
And there is plenty of evidence to support that, right? I think what gives me, and not to say anything against neuroscientists, I have some of my best friends who delve in the world of neuroscience, but I think as a psychiatrist, you have the ability to navigate two different worlds. You have the ability to navigate the pure biology of a symptom, which is your brain neurochemistry, but at the same time, you also have the ability, the benefits of changed chemistry that you view from therapeutic interventions that have nothing to do with medicine at all. More and more research coming out on how people getting treated with PTSD through a functional MRI will have less blood distribution towards the amygdala, right? We know we change our brain chemistries because it was back in the 80s where we realized all Prozac does is it blocks the serotonin reuptake. Like any neuroscientist will tell you that that's a very overtly simplistic explanation of what any of our molecules are supposed to do. We've moved to the point where we understand there is neurotropic relationships between substances and factors, and our brain is an ever-growing organ with neurons that have pruning and increasing, and every synapse, there's improved connections. And can mindfulness improve those connections? I mean, yes. Harvard published it, UCLA has published it, so why would a psychiatrist sit and say otherwise? But if you want me to prescribe something, you better as well bring the evidence for it, because otherwise I may accept it, but I can't prescribe it.
And my answer is grow your own, right? Any questions from the audience, Siddharth? I see some comments.
Yeah, so let me go down the chat box. I think there's one down here from Reshma. Do you observe that South Asian immigrants in the US of different faiths tend to be more orthodox and rigid than those who live in the home countries? The home countries seem to be changing and evolving with the time and effects of globalization, while the immigrants in the US seem to close in more and more on their boundaries and circles.
Yeah, I do feel, I think when we are in a minority setting, the need to preserve our heritage, our authenticity, we go in an overdrive because, but this is not only happening in our religions. I studied this in Judaism, that initially the Judaism was very open and was all about integrating into the host country. But then there came a point that they are now so, were so afraid that they are losing their religion completely or their belief system, or like, you know, you cannot, there was no concept of converted, somebody couldn't convert into Judaism, right? You had to be, have to have a Jewish mother to be Jewish. So again, now I've talked to a lot of parents that they are so now promoting that their kids should marry into religion, that I see them now coming, the wave is changing. So I feel that that's part of the process of immigration, that you go in overdrive, you overcompensate, and then, but I do see the change is coming with the other next generation always will have a different version of things. So that's my experience.
And I'm wondering if Arvind could speak to it, because this is your area of study. But I always talk about people stuck in time warps. I always smile and say, you know, people who immigrated in the 80s are kind of exactly what Reshma is talking about, sort of more orthodox and centric in their beliefs. And I wonder if it is because when we view our history, you know, when we were moving 47, we're still a young country. We're not economically very sound. And the tag of exceptionalism at the point only being attached to religion, whereas now we also have classism, which is rampant. So now people feel exceptional because a lot more things than religion alone. But people would do that more back when we didn't have as big a classism in India. And I wonder if that plays into when they move here, if the only identity that they attached exceptionalism to was religion, and now they're in a place where they want to preserve it, it's much harder for them than for somebody who then saw India's economy open up, right? And classism came in. So now you can attach exceptionalism to your class as much as you attach it to religion. Not saying it's a good thing. I wonder if it's an is thing. What your thoughts on that are?
So
and to add to it, I'm sorry. And to add to it, I think it's also the identity, the preservation of the identity, you know, when they've come out into this, and it's more of that too, you know. So I think, you know,
Yes, I agree. Identity, and also, Shuchi, you mentioned time warp. You've hit the nail on the head. It's basically they've solidified, sedimented the notion of history and time once they've moved out and haven't moved forward, whereas the home country, they have. I get a lot of Sikhs in the Punjab making comments like, you know, you guys out in the diaspora are quite backward, actually. We've moved forward 30 years and, you know, you're still stuck in this time frame from 50 years ago or something. It's exactly that. I think faced with the host culture, we tend to stick with an idea of identity and culture that we're familiar with. And, you know, it in the home country, it's moving forward. It's constantly changing and transforming. And I think you hit the nail on the head there.
If I may add to what everybody said, Reshma, and I think this also connects with the question you were asking. There's a famous psychologist, his name was John Berry. I don't know if anybody's heard of that name, but probably one of the leading scholars in the area of, acculturation and assimilation and all of those terms. And he has this, it's a very simple but very elegant model of how people deal with, migrating from a home culture, if you will, to a new culture, right? And there are essentially two things he says in a simplistic way, and of course it's a model, so it has to be simplistic. He says, look, you have an option. You can either reject or accept your home culture once you've moved, and you can either reject or accept your host or your new culture once you've moved, right? And that gives you a 2x2 matrix, right? There are 4 possible outcomes. And the outcomes are basically assimilation, which is when you adopt the host culture's norms over your original one. So you accept the host and kind of let go of the origin. Separation is when you reject the host and you preserve the origin. And I think that's sort of the phenomenon you were speaking to. Integration is when you adopt the cultural norms of your host, but you also maintain the cultural norms of your origin country. And marginalization is when you reject both, right? So those are at least theoretically the 4 different possible outcomes. And there's been quite a lot of work in psychology. This paper was written in the late 1990s. So we've had 20 years. It's actually a very well explored and fascinating area to look at. Why do people stick themselves in that time warp? Who are the kinds of people maybe psychologically who get out of that and take each one of these 4 different paths?
Sorry, you're muted, Siddharth.
Yeah, I'm just putting it in the chat box. John Berry is the guy.
Yeah,
he's a psychologist.
I think that also speaks to the colonial engineering of history and the way that has affected South Asians in general. The British constructed firm origins of these traditions, these religions, whereas the actual traditions themselves never saw themselves as originating in a particular point or a particular time in place. It was much more fluid, as Siddharth has already kind of mentioned to us. So the notion of origin and its fixity has a very colonial kind of understanding to it as well. So I think it's all kind of fitting together.
Can I just compliment you all? I had another meeting that I postponed because this really captured me. And I think one thing I wanted to say about the immigrants, this question that Reshma is addressing, my issue is I think when we come here as a diaspora, we stop reading history. So all this 19th century William Jones stuff, this is something as immigrants we should read, we should teach in our classes. That we were constructed as Hindus and Muslims by the British. So I think that's something those of you like Siddharth who are like leaders of our community, you need to get the Indians to read more history. That's that's my and when you were talking to when Farha and I have lunch, we don't think that we are, in fact we think we are the same because we are speaking the same everything, So I just wanted to thank you for a really nice, this is what summer vacations are for, is to listen to things like this.
Thank you so much, Jyotsna. I do want to, the point that you made, perhaps overtly or obliquely, Arvind, is when you have a colonial power come in, right? It is a minority, right? The British were a very, very tiny minority when they came into India. And they practiced what John Berry would have called separation, right? So you reject the host culture in favor of the culture of origin. And it's one thing to do it as a community that's, 10 people in a million. But when you rule the country that you've come to, it's a whole other ball game. And what does that entail? I think would be a fascinating study psychologically.
Read 2 chapters in my book that specifically look at this. What I looked at was how Sikhs and Hindus internalized British ideas through education. Yes. Not every colonizer is the same. The
Yeah.
British were experts because they set up school systems which pushed it through two different languages, the Anglo-English language and the other language, which they themselves changed. So they had to change the language structure of South Asia to make possible the blueprint, right?
Sure.
To get this out. So their engineering was superb from a colonizer's point of view. And it still has effects on us today.
Well, you know, it's a major conundrum too, Arvind, because I study the Dutch East Indies as well.
Mm-hmm.
And their investment in the educational infrastructure was not even a fraction of what the British did in India, right? And we often actually hold up the investment of the British in the educational system as being highly beneficial, right? Because, you know, in some sense, it equipped their soon-to-be former subjects with the ability to integrate with this kind of, you know, Western-dominated economy in the way that it took Indonesia a lot longer, right? Now, Indonesia had other problems like an authoritarian regime which stifled thought and all for 30 years. But the point is, we look at it as a positive thing. I think the psychological angle is a fascinating one, right? You know, maybe what they inflicted on India psychologically, if you want to call it inflicted or bestowed, however you want to call it, right, is also profoundly different from what happened to people in Indonesia under the Netherlands East Indies.
Yeah.
I think it is safe to say that colonialism separated us and imperialism is bringing us all back together again. So I think coming back to the thought process that we can be our authentic self and still be respectful and accommodating and empathic and caring about others and their faith. That faith should not only be seen as a divisive force, that it can be very unifying.
Absolutely.
Any last comments, everyone?
I just want to thank everybody for their really thoughtful remarks. I mean, this is a lot of food for thought, and it's the beginning of the summer, so hopefully some good work will come out of it from at least some of us who are on this panel.
Thank you very much. This was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our panelists, Farha for organizing it with Mary, to Arvind, Shuchi, and Sapna for taking the time off a beautiful, bright and sunny day here in Michigan. And we hope we'll have more opportunities to get together, perhaps even in person, as more and more of us get vaccinated. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.